Bill Bradley at the New School University in New York last month.
This past week, Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush was interviewed by Iowa Public Television. Here's that interview with the Texas governor.
While some political observers say the campaign for the Republican nomination for president is all but over, you'd have a hard time convincing the jam-packed field of candidates seeking that nomination. In Iowa, there's heavy traffic on the campaign trail anticipating the August 14th Republican poll in Ames and the Iowa caucus scheduled for February 7th. The importance of Iowa's position in the presidential selection process isn't overlooked by the frontrunner, Texas Governor George W. Bush. He's making a third visit to Iowa within 2 weeks. Governor Bush opened his presidential exploratory effort on March 7th. He's bolted to a huge lead in the polls, and that fact is underscored by the $37 million raised by his campaign finance committees. Governor Bush, welcome to Iowa Public Television and to Iowa Press.
Thank you, Dean. And by the way, I'm one person who doesn't think the election is over.
We'll get into that.
I've got a lot of work to do, and I know it, but I thank you for your hospitality.
Across the table, two people who want to question you. David Yepsen of the Des Moines Register, Mike Glover of the Associated Press.
Governor Bush, if we could deal with just that issue, Dean twice used the term front runner. Once suggested the election was about over, and then suggested that you've raised far more money than anyone else. Are you, in fact, the front runner for the Republican nomination? Do you accept that status?
Well, Mike, I accept the fact that the polls are what they are, but there's only one poll that matters here in Iowa, and that's on caucus night, and I know that. I've got a lot of work to do. I've got a lot of people I've got to talk to. I've got to show that I've got the best grassroots organization, the best message, and a record and an experience that will provide, that will show people they can trust me to become the nominee and the president.
Is there a danger in that status? You're far ahead in the polls. Is there a danger that your supporters could be looking past the early test, looking perhaps at the general election?
You bet. There's always a danger. I just came through a re-election campaign in my state. I'm the first governor ever to be elected to back-to-back four-year terms, and early in the speculative period that they kept saying, well, the polls are such that Bush has got it made, which meant I had to work twice as hard. Remember, I'm a guy who saw a great man go from the 90s to the 30s in the 1992 campaign, and I understand the dangers of being the so-called front runner. But here in Iowa, we've got
to what do you attribute that early lead then? You say you've got a lot of work to do. Is it soft support right now?
Oh, I don't think so, Dean, but that's what the Ames straw poll will determine. We'll show how we do. I think it's because people know I know how to lead, that I've got a record. I think I know the Republicans are looking for a different type of candidate. They're looking for someone who can unite our party and for someone who can reach across non-traditional lines. And so when I got reelected, people saw that I got nearly 50% of the Latino vote in my state. I think that impressed my fellow Republicans. They also know that I'm a person who can set clear agendas and get things done. I've signed the 2 largest tax cuts in my state's history. We reformed welfare. I've worked closely with the Farm Bureau in the state of Texas. I mean, people know I've got a record of accomplishment.
Governor, one of the things we like to do on this program is give candidates a chance to give Iowans their message, their commercial, if they will. So give us your commercial.
Here's my commercial. I want America to be prosperous, but there must be a purpose to prosperity. I understand governments don't create wealth. Governments create an environment in which entrepreneurship and producers can flourish. That's why I support cutting the tax rates. That's why I support getting rid of the death penalty. That's why I support making sure that the Earned Income Tax Credit does not penalize single women with children. I'm a fierce advocate of free trade. I believe that it is important for us to end barriers and tariffs everywhere so that the world trades in freedom. I won't use agricultural products, for example, as kind of a secondary negotiating chip. It is important for us to open up markets all around the world for farmers and producers. I know we must be prosperous, David, to maintain the promise to the elderly in this country. So Social Security will be a priority, as will Medicare. And finally, we got to be prosperous to keep the peace. But I'm going to remind people that prosperity alone is simple materialism. There must be a greater purpose to prosperity, and that is to make sure the American dream touches every willing heart. And that's why I will emphasize educating every child. And that's why I will talk about unleashing faith-based institutions and charities that warm the coal to life, so that people understand the American dream is meant for them, and so they understand the difference between right and wrong, and so that we can usher in the responsibility era as we head into the 21st century.
And tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is George W. Bush?
George W. Bush is first and foremost a loyal husband, and a loyal dad. The most important thing for me is my family. I'm a fellow that made a living in the business world. I was in the oil and gas business for a while in Midland, Texas, the town where I was raised and where I raised my family. I then got into the baseball business and was the managing general partner of the mighty Texas Rangers. I ran for office in 78 and came in second in a two-man field, by the way. And then I ran in 1994 and beat an incumbent governor named Ann Richards. I did so because I was concerned about the quality of education. I did so because I was worried about entrepreneurship and small businesses. I did so to reform the welfare system. And I've done in office what I said I would do. I never really dreamed about running for president, David. I'm as surprised as a lot of my friends are that here I sit as talking to you in Iowa about becoming the next president. But I made up my mind to run, and I'm running for a reason which I just laid out. And I intend to win, and I intend to win in a way, though, that'll bring dignity and honor to the process.
You mentioned earlier prosperity. Your campaign has been relatively prosperous. You've raised $37 million and have $30 million in the bank. Your critics suggest you ought to buy the election. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond that elections are never purchased. There is no such thing as purchasing an election.
Well, what does your campaign fundraising say about the role of money in politics?
My campaign says that over 80,000 Americans, 80,000 folks, have stood up and said, we want George W. to be the nominee. Now, it's important for people who listen to this show to understand there's no corporate giving to my campaign. There's no labor union money in this campaign. These are dollars given by hard-working people from all across the country who give no more than $1,000 per person. And this is one of the most, this is a far-reaching, grassroots effort by people to say, we support George W., and I am honored. And I will tell you this, I know some of people in the field are complaining about my capacity to garner support, my capacity to have the people speak, but I suggest to you, they'd like to trade places.
Governor, come on. When you say there's no corporate money in there, you've got some PACs and some lobbyist money in there.
But that's not, that's
well, what's the difference between lobbyist money and corporate money?
Well, the difference is that it's corporate money is given at the expense of shareholders.
What about?
And I have some political action committee money, but so does everybody else. And my percentage of political action committee money is very tiny compared to the percentage of ordinary people who care about their country. And we'll see whether or not my enthusiasm for how broad the support is true. That's what elections are all about. But what I sense and what I see is people from all walks of life are interested in my candidacy and are willing to contribute to it. And I'm honored to have that support, and I'm humbled.
Governor, one thing going on in our country right now is a debate over tax cuts.
Yes.
It's going on in Washington. The House passed a big tax cut. President Clinton has threatened to veto it. If you were president, would you sign that bill?
I would, but it's going to, well, because it's important to cut rates to keep the economy growing. And it's important to get rid of the death taxes so people can pass businesses and farms from one generation to the next. It's important to leave the marriage penalty tax so we send the right signal that families are foremost and paramount to the stability of our country. So there's a lot of good things in the bill. But as you know what watching legislation is like, there's a series of permutations it's going to go through. But I applaud the House leadership for getting the plan through, and was with my friend John Kasich last night in Cincinnati, who thankfully is aboard my campaign. And I told him how much I appreciated the hard work that the leadership showed on the House floor.
There, you may have heard, coming up in a few weeks, there's going to be a straw poll in Ames.
Really? Michael?
What's at stake in that straw poll, and why has it taken on such seemingly overwhelming importance? Who has the most to lose? Who has the most to gain? And handicap it for us a little bit.
First of all, the system's got a lot to gain to say that grassroots politics matters. I mean, this is an effort for candidates to travel the state and convince precinct workers to get friends to come for one event. And so I think it's good for the system, particularly in a country as large as America, where oftentimes TV dominates politics. I think I've got a lot to gain by seeing how good my organization is. I'm convinced I attracted some of the best citizens in Iowa politics. These are really good folks, and I'm honored they're on my team. And we'll see how they perform. A lot of people were saying, well, oh, George W., you better not participate in the Ames straw poll. And our folks here in Iowa said, we want to compete, and we want to compete hard. And I said, let's get it. Let's get after it. And so we'll see what happens. It's up to you guys to do the handicapping and to decide who wins and
Do you
loses.
think the field gets winnowed after that straw poll, or the candidates who can't survive before showing there?
Mike, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what's going to happen. I'm focused on doing the best job I can do. And so far my trips to Iowa have been very productive. I've enjoyed the trips. We have big crowds. One of the things I try to do when I come to your state is to shake hands with every single person that shows up to our events. Look them in the eye and tell them I'd like their support and listen to their concerns.
You see it as imperative that you win big in that straw poll, as big as you're leading the polls?
No, not really. I think it's imperative that I came and competed and showed people in this state that I want to win the caucuses. The big event is the caucuses. This is a warm-up for the caucuses. This is a test to see what kind of organization we have and how my message is resonating. And Dean, the winning and losing aspect is going to be up to the people who write the stories, particularly these two guys. That's why I'm being so nice to them.
Well, Governor, one thing that's happened here is your folks paid $43,000 rent to the Iowa Republican Party for a plot of ground outside the Coliseum there in Ames to for you to have a rally.
We did.
A lot of people think you got took that way, that's a little excessive even by Iowa standards to pay that kind of money for rent. What do you say to that?
I say, well, it better be a good piece of land. I told our guys, if we're leasing a piece of land, it better be a good one. And I hadn't even seen it yet, so I'll let you know whether it's a good one or not. But the money goes for a good cause. It goes to the Republican,
right.
Iowa Republican Party. I mean, and this exercise, by the way, is party building. And one of the things that's important to remember is the Ames straw poll is important and the caucus is important. But what's really important is taking the White House in the year 2000. It is important for Republicans to remember we're arguing over shades of gray generally. Mm-hmm. And that we've got to remember what the task is. And the task is to defeat Al Gore, presuming he becomes his party's nominee.
There was a dust-up when you rented that piece of land. You recruited some soft money supporters to pay for it, and you later changed your mind, decided to pay for it out of your campaign coffers. Was it a mistake to recruit that money?
Well, there was a little bit of confusion, I guess. The Republican Party of Iowa told folks that was acceptable, that they would receive money and from outside campaigns, so to speak. And we said fine. And then when we realized there was any doubt whatsoever in the law, we wrote checks out of the hard count, so to speak, and we made good we conformed to the spirit of the law, and I think that's important.
What do you say, Governor, to your critics, and you hear this both inside the Republican Party and outside, that you're trying to buy the election, that this $43,000 and the whole thing with the soft money was an indication that George W. Bush is trying to buy this thing?
That's absurd. David, you and I both know that you don't buy elections, you earn them. And the reason I'm going to win in Iowa, the Iowa caucuses, is because not only will I have a great organization, a well-meaning, motivated people, I will have a message that speaks to our better angels, not our darker impulses. I will have a message that will unify the Republican Party so that we can win. And I will have a message based upon a conservative philosophy that is also compassionate. It is conservative to cut taxes. It's compassionate to give the people their own money back. It's conservative to insist upon local control of schools and basic education and high standards. And it is compassionate never to quit on any child. And so I intend to win, not because of how much money I raised, which is an indication, by the way, of huge support, but I'm going to win because I have a positive message, one that people will be proud of, and I will attract new faces and new voices to the Republican Party. You mark my words. You watch what happens if I'm the nominee. We're going to have a Latino campaign that people are going to go, my goodness, what has happened to the Republican Party? It's changed its face. And it needs to. Our party needs to. We need to welcome new folks. We need to welcome new Americans into the Republican Party. We need to have a message that says the Republican Party cares about people who live in decaying cities and who live on the outskirts of poverty. Our philosophy is one that is uplifting and hopeful, and we better have somebody who can say that to the American people loud and clear. Otherwise, we're not going to win in 2000.
Well, Dr. Bush, I'd like you to take a look at the patient, the Republican Party.
Okay, thank you.
What is the condition?
I thought you were elevating me.
Well, what is the condition
like you,
of this
I barely
party?
got out of college.
With some help.
That's right.
But there are some conservatives who are nervous with that message. One conservative, New Hampshire Senator Bob Smith, has already taken a walk.
Yeah.
So the party's moved away from that. What's the health of this tension within the Republican Party between conservatives and moderates? Can you turn off conservatives with that message?
Well, I am a conservative. Mike. You don't win governor of Texas unless you're a conservative person. I also happen to have a heart. I also happen to care a lot about people. And I think it's imperative for our party to say to people all across America, we care about you. That's why I talked about this faith-based initiative yesterday. It says that prosperity must be greater than just making money. It says that the danger as we head into the 21st century is that as the economy changes, some will be left behind. And we better do something about it as a country. I happen to believe our philosophy, which uplifts the individual and does not rely upon government as a solution to all problems, is the best way to make sure that people aren't left behind.
What do you say to social...
Well, I say to the conservatives...
I mean, they say, we'd rather hear you talk about abortion, we'd rather hear you talk about economic nationalism, we'd rather hear you talk about gun control, we'd rather hear you talk about the death penalty.
I'll be glad to talk about all those subjects and do all the time. I think I'm one of... Well, several of us have a record in the race. I've actually taken stands on those positions, but more than taking stands, I've actually done something. But let me finish. There are going to be some in our party who aren't happy with me. But that's okay. That's what politics is about.
Well, we want
I don't expect 100% of the people to agree with me. It's like my old friend, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, told me one time. He was the Democrat who endorsed my re-election, by the way, Bob Bullock. He said, Governor, if you and I agreed 100% of the time, one of us wouldn't be necessary. And so I don't expect 100% of the people to agree with me. I do believe most Republicans are going to agree with the fact that the important thing to do is to win the White House.
David?
That we got judges to appoint, and we've got an agenda to set.
Governor, one of the things we like to do on this program is allow candidates to respond to the criticisms and some of the negatives that have been raised about them. So I want to throw a couple at you.
Are there some?
Yeah. One is that you're simply cashing in on your dad's last name. That if you were George Walker, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation today. What do you say to that?
I say, David, that first, I'm a proud son of a guy I love a lot. And I'm lucky to have been raised by George and Barbara Bush. Secondly, I inherited half his friends and all his enemies. And I'm trying to pick up the other half of his friends and maybe peel off a few of his enemies.
What do you say to the critics who say you cashed in on some shady deals on the Texas Rangers? That when you sold that business, you made a lot of money off of what were essentially taxpayer investments?
I say it's absurd.
Why?
Well, first of all, first of all, we had an election in the city of Arlington where the people of Arlington could stand up and say, do we want to support building the greatest baseball park ever built? And with a huge turnout and an overwhelming numbers, the people of Arlington, Texas said yes. This was a deal that was very public and was approved by the people. And secondly, my investor group, put a lot of money into the franchise ourselves, and we improved the franchise and made it a fabulous baseball franchise.
This country just went through a national trauma over the personal behavior of a president. Can you assure Republican primary voters there is nothing in your past that will embarrass them if they choose to support you?
I'll tell people I made mistakes 25 to 30 years ago. But I'll also tell them I've learned from the mistakes. And when I put my hand on the Bible, Mike, I will swear to uphold the laws of the land, and I will swear to uphold the honor and the dignity of the office to which I have been elected. So help me God. It's the pledge I made in Texas, and it is the pledge I will make and keep to America.
Should that be a relevant part of a campaign? Should the character of a candidate be something that voters examine and look at when they make a decision?
What's relevant is the character of the person sitting right in front of you. That's what's relevant.
Let me switch our discussion into some issues, and one of the issues in Iowa right now is the condition of the farm economy. Does that farm economy need an immediate infusion of operating capital, and how would you do that? How would you suggest it? And then what's the long-term solution?
First, I want the folks of Iowa to understand that I'm the governor of an agricultural state. I've worked closely with farmers since I've been the governor. I've got great relations with the Texas Farm Bureau. And I understand how tough things are. And I understand this is not an asset issue, this is a cash flow issue facing Iowa farmers and Texas farmers and farmers all across the country. And yes, the short-term solution is cash infusion, and the United States Congress and the President ought to pass legislation which will inject cash at least to the amount that was passed during the last legislative session into the farm economy. But this time, not only should they appropriate the money, they ought to disperse it in an efficient, fast way. The long-term solution, in my judgment, is markets. I believe that the President of the United States ought to have fast-track negotiating authority, and I believe the President of the United States ought to aggressively market U.S. products overseas. I think it was a mistake not to open up the markets in China. I think China should have been admitted to the World Trade Organization for a couple of reasons. For example, one, it would have been really good. It would have been really good for U.S. producers and farmers. Secondly, enterprise and free enterprise and trade is going to help change the attitude of Chinese.
Well, Governor,
it just is. One other thing
ahead.
I want to say. And I think it's important for the president to make this pledge, the next president, hopefully the next president, that we will not use food as an economic weapon. We will not use food as a sanction.
Governor, you mentioned trade. There are a lot of people in Iowa who think NAFTA, free trade, is sort of a rip-off, that it's allowing cheap goods to come into America and it's exporting jobs. A lot of working people lose their jobs over that. What do you say to critics of free trade who don't think it's such a good deal?
Well, David, I think free trade is a good deal. I think what's important about free trade is for jobs lost, there are jobs gained. That it recognizes that we live in a global economy, that the world is changing, and what we ought not to do is try to retreat within our borders. What we ought to do is train people for the new high-paying, high-quality jobs that exist. What I see trade as doing is stimulating and interesting and encouraging job growth. The nature of our economy is changing to the better. And I think we need to take advantage of our competitive advantages as a country. We're great producers of agricultural products, but we're great producers of intellectual products as well. And new wealth is being created, and new jobs are being created because we trade, and we trade hard. And I'm a strong supporter of NAFTA. I'll tell you another reason why NAFTA is important. It is important to take advantage of our friendships and alliances in the hemisphere so we can trade almost as a bloc against the Far East and Europe. And it's important for us to recognize that Mexico is not an enemy but a friend. And we want our friends to do well. And the better Mexico does, the less pressure there will be on our borders and less pressure there will be for people who are feeding their families to want to come illegally into our country. If a man's got a family to feed and can find pretty good work in his own country, he's going to stay home. But if he's poor and he's got mouths to feed, he's coming up to Iowa and he's coming up to Texas. He doesn't care. You know, family values don't stop at the Rio Grande River.
What do you say to a social conservative who comes to you and says, Governor, the most important issue to me is opposition to abortion? Where are you on that issue?
The goal in America ought to be that every single child ought to be protected by law and welcomed into life. I'm pro-life. I ran as a pro-life governor. I've governed as a pro-life governor.
But will you appoint pro-life judges?
I will appoint people who will strictly interpret the Constitution and will not use the bench as a way to write law.
But is there a litmus test for President George W. Bush to apply to judges?
No, I've been pretty clear on that subject, David. My test is judicial temperament. Do we share the same philosophy? And will the person use the bench to write law, which I strongly oppose, or will that person, you know, adhere strictly to the Constitution?
Another issue important to a lot of Iowa Republicans, gun control.
Yes.
What's your position on gun control?
The best gun control is to arrest people who commit the crime with guns. The best gun control is to strictly adhere and enforce the law. This administration that now exists in the White House has been really lax about gun enforcement law. Now, I do think we need laws to keep the guns out of the hands of people we don't want to have them. That's why I support instant background checks. Instant background check system, when fully implemented, is going to be able to say to people who sell guns, this person is entitled to buy one, this person isn't.
Do we need more laws? Or just sufficient, more enforcement of the current laws?
I think we need more enforcement of the current laws. I think we need to send a clear signal that if you break the law carrying a gun, you're going to be arrested, period. I think innocent people ought not to be punished by law.
You talk a lot about education when you're out on the stump. You say it's one of the most important issues, if not the most important issue to you, should you be elected. Specifically, what should the federal government be doing in education that's not doing now?
Specifically, what it ought to be doing is passing more power back to the states and giving more states more flexibility and authority over all the federal programs which are spent. We ought to be block granting money. The second thing the federal government ought to be doing is paying for special education, or at least giving the states the flexibility to apply federal monies to their special ed programs. And this hurts states like Iowa a lot. As a matter of fact, I heard your current governor at the White House tell the president and the vice president, all the rest of the governors, how important it was for the state of Iowa to have the flexibility necessary to apply federal monies to special ed. Because what happened is the federal government mandated special ed programs, but has only paid roughly 10% of the obligation when in fact the federal government said it would pay 40%.
Should there be a federal Department of Education?
I think so, but the federal government ought to be there to do sound research, sound science on what works, and ought to be active about devolving power back to local jurisdictions, because I believe in local control of schools. I believe in high standards and high expectations, and I believe we ought to measure And I believe we ought to blow the whistle on failure. And when we find kids trapped in failed schools, I support charters and choice. But let me say something. We ought not to have a federal test, a national school test. I think accountability systems ought to be devised by local folks at the local level. The Iowa Basic Skills Test, which we use in some districts in Texas, is a perfect example of a local jurisdiction developing a test to determine whether or not children can read and write.
Governor, we've only got a couple minutes left and too many questions. But Social Security and Medicare. Iowa's the third oldest state in the country. What would President George W. Bush do to keep Social Security and Medicare sound?
First, lockbox the Social Security money. And in plain English, that means when money comes in from payroll taxes for Social Security, it ought to be spent only on Social Security. Secondly, keep the promise to the elderly. Say, we're not going to cut your benefits. We made a solemn obligation to you, and we're going to fulfill that obligation. But we've also got a solemn obligation to youngsters who are now putting money in the system, and so I support personal savings accounts. And I think we can do all this without a payroll tax, and we better do it in order to avoid a payroll tax. In terms of
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. In terms of Medicare, this also is a solemn commitment. I believe the federalization of Medicare has created the disaster it's in. There's over 130,000 pages of rules and regulations that prevent good quality care getting to our elderly. So what I support what the principles behind the Bro-Thomas plan, which is a bipartisan consensus formed by members of both parties, which said we got to give seniors more competition, more product, more availability in the private sector, and we ought to help poor seniors with their premiums.
Governor, you spent 28 minutes here answering questions. What do you say to people who say you're vague on the issues?
I say, come and hear me talk. Come and give me a chance to look you in the eye and tell you what I think, and let me answer your questions, which I do all the time.
We got about 20 seconds left. Military spending.
You bet.
Should it be more or less?
It should be more and
Why?
more efficiently spent, because a dangerous world still requires the United States to maintain an efficient, flexible, strong military. Plus we ought to develop and deploy intermediate-range anti-ballistic missile systems to help keep the peace. David, the world is more uncertain than ever before, and we've got to bring certainty into an uncertain world.
The certainty is that we run out of time. Thank you, Governor Bush,
Thanks,
for
Dean.
being our guest today. On our
Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush in Iowa last Friday. Road to the White House is part